Hello there. I see this is
Hello,
Joshua Colorbar.
how are you today?
All right, how are you?
Yeah, I'm Josh. I'm good, thank you. Good. Looking forward to today's talk. Hannah, are you still with us?
Yeah. Just let me know if you need anything. I'll be doing tech support for the rest of the festival. So if you need anything, give me a shout. But otherwise, just feel free to get going.
All right, so we're good to start. All right. Well, again, thanks everyone for being here. This is super exciting. Today, right now, with this present talk, we've got Lewis Gordon, who'll be talking about decolonizing philosophy. And just to give an introduction of Lewis Gordon, his background, he's a professor and head of department of philosophy at UConn. He's the honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies and visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, as well as honorary professor in the unit for humanities at Rose University. He previously taught at Brown University, where he founded the Department of Africana Studies, and Temple University, where was the Laura H. Connell Professor of Philosophy and founder for the Center of Afro-Jewish Studies. He's the author of many books, including Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, as well as the forthcoming On Philosophy, Decolonization, and Race, as well as Fear of Black Consciousness, which I believe is upcoming. So super excited. Lewis Gordon, feel free to start with your talk.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joshua. I'd like to begin, I'll begin first by issuing my condolences to so many. This meeting is a festival, but we're meeting at a time in which so many have passed away over the past year from COVID-19. And although there are always people passing away from wars to many diseases, one of the frustrating things about what transpired over the past year is that so much of it was avoidable. In a way, the past year is a testament to the importance of having competent leadership and also, frankly, leadership without malfeasance. So to all of you, I extend my condolences, because for many of you, you already know this because you're experiencing it. What you've lost is the irreplaceable. And if you're curious about why I use that formulation, if you want to read an elaborated version of it, it's a chapter in my book, Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization. But it's something I've been thinking about for 30 years. And it's just a direct realization of how we human beings bring the notion of replaceability into the world, but at the same time, love, devotion, commitment, those elements articulate irreplaceability. So for me, it's morning. For you in the UK, it's early evening. So good evening, and for others, good morning. For those who are connected to Medu Neter, the ancient language of East Africa, and Kemet, which many of you know is Egypt, Hotep, Shalom, Salam Alaikum, Matia Vanakan, that's Tamil for the same thing, hello. And of course, part of my ancestry is also, I was born in Jamaica, so for everybody, how are you keeping? And especially in light of Steve McQueen's wonderful small acts, I think a lot of realization at the level of popular culture in the UK is there in terms of its denied history. So I begin by bringing up a travesty. One of the enduring allegories of philosophy, everybody who studies philosophy gets to talk about this, is Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And for many of you who are familiar with the allegory, in fact, it's presumed that this audience is, they're the people among the shadows. One gets unshackled and goes up, finds a way to the entrance and goes outside. And there's a certain point realizing this individual then goes back down and tries to persuade others to go outside. The philosopher Badiou refers to this effort of trying to bring everybody else outside, the activity of politics. Because of course, if it's going to come down to forcing people to go outside, if there's going to be violence, then at that moment, there is going to be a form of oppression, destruction, dismay, etc. So already within the persuasive elements, the fact that speech, right, the activities of politia, Badiou has an insight there. However, this is a metaphilosophical discussion. My goal here isn't politics. There's an observation of contemporary philosophy. And the observation on contemporary philosophy is that if you pick the same scenario, many, if not most, contemporary philosophers are individuals who, when the shackle is loosened, walk up to the entrance of the cave and find the biggest boulder and put it in front and walk back down. And we could call that professional philosophy. And a lot of the reasons for this is because professional philosophy is not actually guided by philosophy. In fact, some people get really annoyed or upset when I say this, but professional philosophy has few philosophers. And in fact, doing philosophy in professional philosophy is a liability. It's a liability professionally because you won't have to repeat the orthodoxies that would put you in the so-called right journals, the so-called right publishing houses, the so-called right places to get the wonderful career achievements in which you're called a philosopher, despite the fact that you're saying nothing. So this metaphilosophical concern is, how did this come about? Because there was for a long time philosophers who actually say something. Well, part of this is connected to what this talks about, decolonizing philosophy, because it raises the question of what it means for philosophy to be colonized. Well, philosophy's colonization is a circumstance that's connected to not only a crisis in philosophy, but it's also a crisis in knowledge. And sometimes we philosophers forget that philosophy is a subspecies of knowledge practices. And the crisis emerges fundamentally at a very basic level. I don't know why the binging sound is continuing, because I turned off my prompt to my computer. But anyway, it'll just interrupt now and then. So anyway, one of the problems that philosophers will have to deal with is that although there are philosophers who did not collaborate or conspire with this development, the reality is that a lot of the way what's called Western philosophy is practiced today was nurtured by Euro-modern colonialism. And it's pretty embarrassing the extent to which it's not just that it was nurtured, but in some cases, there were philosophers who were the architects of practices of enslavement, dehumanization, colonization, and more. And a neat way out is to try to separate the philosophers from philosophy, but one has to ask oneself whether this is a form of bad faith, because as we know, among those who have performed in that way are philosophers who are in effect canonized in philosophy. So already, at least at the level of historical and just ordinary observation and practice, there is, at least in what's called Western philosophy, a complicit role of philosophy in the uplifting of a form of Euro-modern narcissism, which creates an investment intrinsically in the notion of white superiority. And however truthful people who are outside of that framework may be, however accurate their forms of knowledge, they're ignored except if they could be mediated by those appearances of what's considered legitimate purveyors of knowledge. So in this talk, I will address 5 elements that I'll just, for this context, just summarize. And perhaps in the chat or questions at hand, we can elaborate from there. So I'll talk about 5 ways in which philosophy is colonized. Now, when I say philosophy is colonized, I do not mean that it is completely colonized. There's no such thing as complete colonization. In fact, the belief in completeness is part of a colonial practice. There's always going to be an exception. There will always be people who think differently, just like in the United States, in the midst of a situation where you have a Thomas Jefferson, who is mind-bogglingly contradictory and racist in his analysis of human beings. You also have a Paine, who is the opposite. So this is not meant to be at all an overgeneralization about philosophical practice. It's an analysis of hegemonic practices, which are not the same, which are different. So the hegemonic philosophy is patently colonial. And it's so through a variety of resources, of ways of presenting philosophical knowledge. The first one is racial and ethnic origins of philosophy, all right? And the racial and ethnic origins of philosophy are misrepresentations of the history of philosophy. One of the things that many of us know, of course, especially since we're living in an age of really rampant fascism, if you repeat an untruth sufficiently, it is lived as a truth. And the human mind, rather our brain is such, that we're very good at hypnosis. I always say to people who are trying to learn something, try to do it 3 times. You'll find you're craving to do it the 4th. So if you have a repeated misrepresentation of the history of philosophy, that misrepresented history functions as a truth. The second one is the coloniality of the norms of philosophy, and I'll explain that. The third is the market commodification of philosophy, which I've already hinted at in the way I talked about the state of professional philosophy in relation to the allegory of the cave. The fourth is what I call disciplinary decadence. And the fifth is a form of solipsism that comes out of disciplinary decadence. Now, I will conclude with, among other remedies, what I call a teleological suspension of philosophy. But I should stress that when I say teleological suspension of philosophy, I don't mean only philosophy. And I say this because this problem, although I'm talking about it specifically in the context of philosophy, it's a problem that pertains to many other disciplines as well, which is why I say disciplinary decadence. So I'll begin with the first one. The racial and ethnic origins of philosophy, as we know, has a standard pitch. And the standard pitch is philosophy began among ancient Mediterranean Greek-speaking people in Athens, or areas we know today as areas such as Ionia or Western Turkey, etc. And it is reputed to have begun 2,500 years ago. So we're roughly talking about 500 BCE, pre-Socratics, etc. And this is the standard repeated falsehood. Now, when I mention this falsehood immediately makes people say, well, produce evidence otherwise. The big difficulty is that there is so much evidence otherwise that one has to wonder, why does this continue? Now, to give you an idea, when I teach my courses, all my philosophy courses, I try to put in the syllabus a piece of writing from ancient philosophy that's non-Western right away in the syllabus, in a paragraph before they've even read any of the text, just right there. And we discuss that right away, immediately. And there are many I could bring, but one of them I love to use is one from Antef. Now, Antef was an ancient East African philosopher. And one of the things that we know about ancient philosophy is that it's not only that ancient philosophers philosophized about reality, but also ancient philosophers engage in metaphilosophy. They talked a lot about what in the world are we doing when we do philosophy. And they also talked a lot about who are philosophers. Well, this philosopher Antef, wrote the following, and this is my translation. It's in the language of Medu Neter. And all Medu Neter means is divine speech, but it's a language that was spoken by the ancient East African people of Kemet. And the more ancient they are, which is the Old Kingdom, the more African they were. By the Middle and the others, they were more increasingly Creolized community, a community that's linked into West Asia and East Africa. So this is the period where it's just mostly East African. Antef writes, the philosopher or the lover of wisdom is he or she whose heart is informed about these things which would be otherwise ignored. The one who's clear-sighted when he or she is deep into a problem. The one who's moderate in his or her actions, a little shout out for the Aristotelians out there, who penetrates ancient writings, whose advice is sought to unravel complications, who is really wise, who instructed his or her own heart. So Antef is saying a philosopher is also a person who learns how to teach her or himself, who stays awake at night as he or she looks for the right paths, who surpasses what he or she accomplished yesterday. Philosophers are people who are also devoted actually to getting somewhere when we think and we do intellectual work. Who is wiser than a sage? I always find this part amusing. I mean, sages, to my knowledge, are pretty wise. So to be wiser than a sage is some serious wisdom. Who brought himself or herself to wisdom, who asks for advice and sees to it that he or she is asked advice. Now, we usually discuss this, but what we eventually get to is the date. Because this quotation, the inscription of Antef, is from the 12th dynasty in Kemet, which is roughly around 1900 BCE. So, for many of you who do the history of philosophy, you already know this is 1,000 years before the pre-Socratics. Now, my point here is not who was first, because being first doesn't mean being better. We already know that. But what's crucial here is that you see the students having discussed this when they meet a professor or another student in another department in another course, who may say that philosophy began with ancient Greece, blah, blah, blah. The student can say, no, it didn't. And if the person challenges them, they could not only name a name, but they have discussed an actual text. And this is very important because you see, there is a form of epistemological dependency happens if we tell people, but don't bring them in touch with the evidence, with the material. One of the ways in which ancient Greek philosophy and ancient Roman philosophy have become hegemonic. And by the way, I don't like to say those terms. I prefer to just say ancient Mediterranean philosophy because there were many languages and many ways in which they communicated. But that understanding of dealing with those ancients, one of the things that begins to come to mind is that because we can name texts by Plato or by Aristotle or by Protagoras, or if we go to the Stoics and, if we work all the way through from also the Cynics, from Diogenes all the way through to various writers like Seneca, the fact that we can actually engage them is a way for them to speak for themselves. So the question that begins to be raised here is, why don't we do the same with other philosophers? And the truth of the matter is, in the past, people did. But the impact of Euro-modern colonialism has within it an investment in making people believe not simply that there weren't other philosophers or other ways of thinking philosophy, but it moves to the next level of ideological imposition, which is that there couldn't be others. There mustn't have been others. And this is where we get into some deep epistemological trouble. Now, the thing that becomes even more complicated when we're dealing with these notions of racial ethnic origins, is that another move, of course, is to go through something that's just clearly fallacious, which is simply to talk about the word philosophy. But the problem is most of the people with whom we share the word philosophy from philosophia, they'll see what they see as a Greek word, and it seems to end the story. But a lot of the audience, a lot of the students don't realize the extent to which there has been a form of historical construction of the Greek language in a way that reinforces a certain fallacy. And the fallacy is that if you're dealing with anything conceptual or intellectual, the archaeolinguistics will always point to the Greek or the Latin language. It's as if the rest of humanity just didn't know how to think in their own languages, and that somehow conceptual language had to wait for the so-called Greek miracle. The problem with that, and this takes other forms too, because when we're talking about racism here, the old racist desire for polygenesis was thwarted, of course, by what we have discovered of not only about the genetic history of our species, but also the paleohistory. But this doesn't mean the notion of polygenesis has died. And it took its form by moving from biology to culture to language. And thus, the romanticization of the Indo-European language, the language group, came about in an effort to separate so-called Indo-European people from African peoples, which is really weird because especially Northeast Africa, is Mediterranean. And it's very weird to know that people who are so close could have no linguistic relationship. It's just really weird. And I remember in my own education, one of the fortunate things is I didn't only study philosophy and politics and physics, but I also studied classics. And also because I'm a Jewish person, I had to learn Hebrew. So I noticed certain things because I could read in the original Greek and Latin, that I saw certain terms that clearly were Hebrew terms. And I also see in Hebrew certain terms when I began to study Medu Neter, which is an older language, clearly terms from Medu Neter. But it's not only in Hebrew, but I could see the connections in European languages. And this is because humanity has always been interacting and trading with each other. And so the idea of purity is part of the colonial practice that misrepresents the history of philosophy. And of course, if we get to the word philosophy, the word Sophia, as an example, is a Greco transformation of an African word. The African word, and it'll take up too much of this lecture to go through it, because in the African language, Medu Neter, there's so many ways to talk about wisdom. Most English speakers today, at best, could name 3. But in those languages, there were up to 20, 30, some cases 36 terms. But I want to talk about one. And one is Sabayat, which just means wise teaching. Sai is the root word, but it was later pronounced like so. And the ba among the Greek-speaking people became fa, and it was transformed into Sophia. But Sabayat, wise teaching, became Sophia. And this is one of the reasons why we have this connection. Now, the point here, again, I've already said this, is not about who said what first. It's about the idea that humanity thinks in a relational way. And in that relational way, it means that we need to eradicate this notion that there were people in very ancient times preceding the Attic period in what we call Greece, who just walked around scratching their heads, dumbfounded, just waiting for the Greek language. But the inheritance of this is one of the things that affect the way we do philosophy. Because once that is the case, then not only is there a failure to understand the complexity of the origins of philosophy, but the additional problem is that even the philosophers get transformed. So you could have an African philosopher by the name of St. Augustine, who is just rewritten in our memory as looking like Santa Claus. You could have an African woman like Hypatia, and then again, she's portrayed as a white woman. In other words, the need for the legitimation of philosophical philosophers as whiteness is a colonial practice. And we could even go further when we think about how we even think about the origins of related disciplines to philosophy, such as mathematics and physics. Because again, if we masculinize them, we fail to understand that in many ancient societies, the people who were producing mathematical knowledge, the people who were producing forms of scientific knowledge, particularly of nature, were women. And as we begin to understand their women, we begin to look at not only the ideas of women, ancient women, in a very different way, but we begin to understand that the history, the foundational history, is much more complex, diverse, and broad than we've thought. A lot of people are surprised when I point out Nefertiti was a philosopher because they just know her as a beautiful woman. But they don't realize that Akhenaten and Nefertiti developed the emanation theory of reality, through which they were able to articulate their form of monotheism. But anyway, so that's one. Now, the coloniality of norms. When I say coloniality here, I need to first make a crucial distinction. Because when we study, there's a criticism about colonialism, and there's a movement in global Southern philosophy that's called the critique of coloniality. Now, some of what I've been talking about so far is linked to coloniality. The argument is that you can decolonize a society, but its normative framework, its epistemological framework as well, could actually be designed in such a way that they're symbiotic with colonization. As a consequence, although you're formally post-colonial, you're in everyday practice the continuation of colonial norms. And so those people argue that if you are to get rid of that, you need to move from decolonization to decoloniality. Now, for many of you, what's very tricky here is that, and the next part I'm going to get, in part 4, I'll get to this, but right now, there's already a form of schism in philosophy, a form of fetishizing in philosophy that leads to the equivalent of going back into shackles in the cave through the way in which one announces oneself as a philosopher. And we already know this because if one defines oneself as an analytical philosopher, it's not actually about analytical philosophy itself. It's a form of almost epistemological gang warfare commitment not to learn from other ways of doing philosophy. And so the analytical philosopher may ignore the pragmatist, the phenomenologist, may ignore what the philosopher in India or in Japan and Africa might be saying, et cetera, unless they in effect turn themselves into, in the language, popular language of today, brown and black bodies in white face. And this means that there's a form of whiteness already intrinsic in certain forms of philosophy, including, and especially actually, analytical philosophy. Now, this is not to say that Eurocontinental philosophy doesn't have its whiteness, but its whiteness is presented in a very different way. So if we're going to deal with this, we need first to, I need to just mention a certain point, that the decolonizing and decoloniality critique, it's clearly linked to what happened in the last half of the 20th century in what can be called post-structuralism. So that's more the continental wing. And the continental wing promised a whole lot with what post-structuralism was to deliver. As we know, and again, I'm not going to get into all the details here, it'll take up too much time, but there were textual post-structuralists and genealogical post-structuralists. Textual post-structuralists tend to fetishize texts, and that's where the Eurocentrism comes in. Because at the end of the day, even if they're saying they're not going to be like the analytical philosophers and not be connected to history and reality, but just bare arguments. Nevertheless, there is a form of textual fetishism that recenters Europe repeatedly. Then there are the genealogical post-structuralists who say, yes, you're correct. And they will point out practices of what's called knowledge power. But the thing is, they then analyze it in a very Eurocentric way. So the decolonial theorists came up and they said they're not going to deal with knowledge power in the way, say, Foucault did. They're going to deal with the coloniality of philosophy. But in effect, the genealogical post-structural argument continues, but with a replacement of coloniality instead of knowledge power. Now, I won't get into details here, but for historic reasons, one of the things about post-structuralism is that it was presented as if it was a more liberatory force, particularly in academic thought, not just in philosophy, but in literature and many other disciplines. But a big problem, as we know, is just as I just gave the critique of how Euromodern colonialism nurtured was actually the fertile grounds for a colonial form of philosophy, neoliberalism was a real fertile ground for post-structuralism. And that led to a lot of embarrassment. And we know that embarrassment is there because you don't meet many people today who would call themselves post-structuralists. Yet they continue with post-structural forms of argumentation. It's just today many call themselves critical theorists. And the critical theorists tend to be textual post-structuralists. The decolonial theorists tend to be genealogical post-structuralists. So already you could see a movement going here. Because now the very question of decolonization repeats itself in a call at a meta-theoretical level for the decolonization of decolonial thought and the decolonization of critical theory. But if we get now into the other areas of philosophy, if we talk about the coloniality of norms, we can bear in mind that there are certain models of philosophy that have taken on colonial practices of warfare. And again, this is connected to a very complex history because Euromodern philosophy is connected actually to a Christianity that was whose eschatology was premised upon war. And so the practices, even the language of how to deal with philosophical argumentation is often agonal or warlike. Now, what do I mean? Well, people talk about how they're going to knock down another person's argument, how they're going to defend their argument. This language of warfare treats philosophy as fighting. But as I often mention to my students, it's possible to win a fight and be wrong. When one focuses more on the fighting, one loses sight of the whole point of what initiated the struggle in the first place. Now, there are other ways of thinking about philosophical practice that could be in the form of demonstration, explanation. And when you're to demonstrate, you're already moving outside of the framework of eliminating the other into a framework in how to be in a relationship with another. Already embedded deep down in that approach is a different metaphysics. Because see, the other approach, which has been inherited in many ways from a form of Aristotelian Christianity, which is also taken on by Cartesianism and etc., that is based on a substance-based metaphysics, which means that ultimately it has to purify itself and thus uses the law of non-contradiction for elimination. But the other model in which there's an effort to reach to reality, to understand reality, which that model is rather interesting in that it's not premised upon a notion of completeness through the practice of elimination, but it may be more dialectical. It could be connected to the idea that there could be a fundamental incompleteness through which there is always more, which means then the effort is to see what one has failed to see, hear what one has failed to hear, understand what one has failed to understand, etc. And that's a more communicative model in which philosophy as relational has to have a different set of norms. Instead, this is not to say there's never a time to fight. It's not that there's never a place for the warrior. The mistake is to think, just as with the origins debate, that doing philosophy is like the Highlander series where you have to chop off other people's heads because there could only be one. So in that framework then, it means that philosophy has to raise the question of the very metaphysical assumptions under which it is practiced. And not only metaphysical, because if it's going to be relational, it means it has to go beyond metaphysical, which means it raises questions of the political and more. So I come to the third. The third is the market commodification of philosophy. This is the easiest one to go through, because I've already mentioned it in terms of the lore of why you could have people with philosophy degrees who don't do philosophy. Because it means to do philosophy might be a market liability. This is one of the things that in antiquity philosophers struggled with all the way through to the present. Great philosophers, so to speak, are risk takers, are people who are willing to lose it all. But this is not the norms of the profession, because as we know, under neoliberalism, but not just neoliberalism, but it's also neoconservatism, but it's deeper than that, because you see, again, I'm not elaborating as much, but the converging forces through which you have Euro-modernity also were converging forces of a form of triumphant Christianity, which was called the Reconquest. And it had with it the rise of Euro-modern capitalism. And capitalism also asserted itself in the practice of conquest in the form there can only be one, which is why capitalism becomes a shift from the plurality of markets to the concept, which is a Theodician concept called the market. And connected to the market, Christianity, etc., is a notion that the subject for the market becomes that or those in whom, by virtue of who and what they are those who embody the very purpose of the market itself, and they function like gods. And so the market, fetishized as a god, has to not have an outside. It must have as its reach all, which means that with the rise, not simply of capitalism, but the deification of capitalism, is the commodification of everything. And this is one of the reasons why today we don't really talk so much about the knowledge of the market, but the market of knowledge. We don't really talk so much about the politics about how we deal with the market, but the market of politics. And the same applies to education. Instead of the education system through which we relate to, say, economic forces or the market, it becomes the market of education. And you could see this in concrete form in the history of what we call the university. I don't like the term university, by the way. I prefer communities of higher learning, but that's another lecture. But what we know is that the Euro-modern university began out of the theological center, the seminaries, and then the arts and sciences became the center. But the arts and sciences are now at the periphery, because the new theological center is the business school. And as the market, now as the theological center is the business school, then the market of philosophy, the philosophy market, begins to subordinate philosophical knowledge. And this leads to the problem of disciplinary decadence. Now, disciplinary decadence is many forms, but the short way of talking about it is the form of bad faith practice in which one treats one's discipline as complete. When one treats one's discipline as complete, then one doesn't have to deal with reality anymore. One just has to deal with the discipline as reality. And this is why disciplinary decadence always leads to the fetishization of methods. If the discipline is treated as if it were created by a god instead of human beings, then all you need to do is follow the method that the god has handed you. The discipline becomes like Moses with the tablets. You get the tablets, and now you follow it. And this is why in many areas of philosophy, the fetishizing of the method closes that philosophy off from reality. And this is why there could be, say, in analytical philosophy, a presupposition that if you just follow a small set of methods, usually baby logic, that you are in some way a philosopher. This is why in Euro-continental philosophy, textual analysis, whether it's hermeneutics, etc., the same thing. And the list goes on. However, if one is engaged in that way, one's very approach of doing philosophy becomes a silo. And it means that philosophies may show up at conferences, but they do not communicate. And if there's a lack of communication, then there's no transcending element through which one can get to reality. And so the problem is that the discipline begins to function like a theodicy. And many of you may not reflect upon this, but a lot of philosophical arguments tend to boil down these days to a variation of either theodicy or the ontological argument. The Theodician argument basically tries to account for the internal integrity of God in the face of evil and injustice. And the classic responses to defend God is to argue that somehow the infelicities are external to God through pointing out the limitations of the human mind. And as a consequence, then, one says there's nothing wrong with philosophy or analytical or continental or whatever you want to call it, what kind. There's something wrong with the philosopher. And then there's another argument that basically says that actually there is free will and people screw things up. God is really good, but we screw it up. And this is another way of saying, again, it's a form of appeal to a form of fallibilism in which the problem is the weakness of a philosopher, but the philosophy remains intact. But there's another possibility, because you see, if one rejects both those arguments, and if one also questions the ontological argument, the move from concept to the idea of ontology, of being, then one may say, perhaps the mistake is that we're treating our discipline as complete. And if we take that move, then we're able to develop a metacritical position in which we can now transcend the discipline and reach beyond the discipline for the sake of something greater. And what is the greater? And the answer is reality. And we know that in the academy today, there are a lot of people who don't like to talk about reality. So this movement of going beyond, I call a teleological suspension of philosophy. But bear in mind that teleological suspensions could apply to any discipline. If a discipline is willing to go beyond itself for the sake of reality, it means it's willing to communicate with other disciplines. And an actual communication with other disciplines would be a form of transdisciplinary practice. Now, this doesn't mean that one has to give up philosophy. It just means that one doesn't fetishize it. One doesn't reduce it to the center of the world. I remember when I was giving a talk many years ago, actually, I can't believe it, it's nearly 30 years ago, where I was pointing out that at that time, didn't call myself a philosopher. I simply said, because there are just too many important questions in philosophy to deal with, and I want to deal with those questions. A questioner in the audience, because by then I'd produced 5 books. The questioner said, you know, Lewis, you don't call yourself a philosopher, but I've read your books. And he said, it's not that you don't do philosophy. It's just that you're doing new philosophy, among other things. And it struck me that he was right, And from that point on, I said, I'm also a philosopher, because there are many other things I do. And when I meet certain people in other disciplines, if I look at their arguments, their explanations, the problems with which they're dealing, I discover that they're dealing with questions that are of philosophical significance and more. So this means that we think about the communicative practice similarly to the way I talked about moving from the agonal model to the demonstrative, communicating, other model. And this is a model in which one moves from the idea, say, of the university, which is a colonial concept, to the learning communities, communities of advanced learning. And those communities, that idea is a practice humanity has been doing for more than several thousand years. So with that, you could see how the critique of disciplinary decadence is a critique of solipsism. Because ultimately, it means one has to move from a reductive model of oneness and purity to the question of relational models, which now brings in the practices that are very exciting going on in philosophies and other areas of theory throughout the global South, and it's happening all over the world right now. One can think about how philosophy beyond philosophy, as a critique of disciplinary decadence, relates to the crealization of theory, where one deals with a living mixture through which theory is able to deal with reality, because reality, it's incoherent to talk about reality in terms of purity. Now, if one says, okay, you talk about mixture, but again, there's a way of talking about mixture that sneaks back in reductive metaphysics of substance. Because what it does is it fetishizes ontology as the model through which to organize reality. The Japanese philosopher Kaiji Nishitani said it very well, that one big problem with Western philosophy is that ontology functions, he doesn't use these words, but I will, in a colonial way. Nishitani's words were that ontology has a nasty habit of covering reality. And so if we begin to move out of that framework and actually have a more communicative, discursive practice, we begin to understand that living philosophy may raise multidimensional questions that may be actually more relevant for the world in which we live. Right now, we live in a world in which we respond to contemporary problems by trying to figure out which past century supposedly got it right. And this is why there's some people who are just stuck in their philosophical thinking in the 18th century, others the 19th. And a lot of contemporary philosophy is actually stuck in the 20th century because a lot of the people who dominate the formulation of philosophy itself as a discipline were trained in the 20th century and have the nasty habit of trying to reproduce their training. It's a lot like a situation I observe. I have a good friend from Antigua, Paget Henry, who's a philosopher and sociologist. And he was entrusted to organize a university in the island of Antigua. So he invited all these Antiguans to come and a few others. And when they had the conference, he noticed something peculiar. All the people who had their PhDs from Oxford wanted to create Oxford in Antigua. All the people who had their PhDs from Cambridge, Cambridge in Antigua. All the people from Harvard, Harvard in Antigua. All the people from the grad center at CUNY, grad center in Antigua, and the list goes, Berkeley in Antigua. They didn't ask themselves whether these are an effort to impose on Antigua shoes that do not fit. And in fact, this has been a critique throughout of a lot of philosophical practice as colonial in Africana philosophy and varieties of other forms of philosophy, precisely because, just as with the social sciences and other areas, when the people don't fit the preconceived paradigms, the tendency is to ask, what is wrong with these people? And that transforms the people into the problems, instead of transforming the discipline as a problem that constitute the people as problematic. So I close with an observation. Among the colonial impositions on philosophy is not simply ontology, but it is also epistemology. We often teach the notion of modern philosophy as inaugurated by Descartes with this centering of epistemology. But we don't realize that in such a practice, we're not only misrepresenting philosophy, but we're even misrepresenting modernity. Because what we do in such practices is to create an isomorphic understanding of the modern with the European. When all modern means is to belong to the present. And you belong to the present by virtue of your relationship to the future. What colonialism does is to try to construct a category of ideas and people who have no place in the future and are thus trapped in the past. And that's why concepts like primitivism, etc., come about. But if one rejects that model, then it means that if one is thinking about what can be produced for the future, what can come, it means that if the future is connected to one's current practices, then one is the present, and as a consequence, modern. Now, I bring this up because the problem with the epistemological paradigm, it makes this question a question of forecasts. It makes it an effort to have the knowledge outcome before the performance. And this bleeds out into a variety of other practices, including political practices, because it makes agency, action, a matter of forecast, when in fact, most of what human beings do are done without forecast. If I return to my initial points about philosophy, we can see this in the fact that what's often presented about philosophy is to treat philosophy as a written endeavor. And I often have to remind my students more than the question that Socrates didn't write and many other philosophers didn't write. But in fact, most of what we do in philosophy isn't written. The fact that right now, most of the times we're doing philosophy, we're speaking, we're interacting, we're teaching, we're going about the world. We need to understand that the written philosophical expression is but a fragment. And if we understand that, it means that philosophy as a living practice is something much more than the question of something we can show on a piece of paper for recognition as an academic. That philosophy is a thinking practice that is linked to a variety of other key practices of the human condition. And those, if we think about the question of colonization and coloniality, become threefold. They become ultimately the question of what it means to be human, because ultimately we human beings are involved in this practice, but also colonization is something fundamentally done against humanity. It means we have to talk about what it means to be free, because we have to understand that there is a form of ability and agency in thinking, and that free thinking is a fundamental part, not only of philosophical practice, but human aspiration. And it means we also have to think about, and this is what this entire presentation has been about, the metacritique of reason. Because as we know, as Karl Jasper said, but also Aurobindo and Nishitani Kaiji or Komichiche, is that reason is one of the hymns of philosophy. But the problem we have is that a whole lot of resources of reason has been used for dehumanization and colonization. And so in the question of the metacritique of reason is addressing the crisis of justification, because philosophical practice always requires evidence, reason, and justification. And so in the decolonization of philosophy then, is not only the liberation of reason and the liberation of justification, but it is also, ironically, a relationship to contingency through which we realize that in our commitment to address reality, which always transcends ultimately our ability to contain it, we're also creating a situation similar to that point about ascending from the cave, because we ultimately are now raising the question of actions that, whether we like it or not, are going to be the conditions of the possibility for whoever comes, but whom we can never in advance know. And what we can ask is, with whatever they inherit, if we do our work at least well, their reflection to us would be those precious words, thank you. And with that, I'm done.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. I thought that was wonderful. I'll keep I have the Q&A open to bringing questions, and I'll kind of relay them to you. Before I get to this first one, I just had a question of my own. I was really interested if you could expound on why you feel that the university as a word and a structure is inherently colonial, which I think is a pretty fiery thing to say. Is it this idea of, do you see universities as functioning on a structure of imposition, of kind of a master will put something onto you and your success is marked by how much you can live up to that thing? Or is it also a thing of the constant revival of the past? Like, I think about Lacan's discourse of university, which is basically, we are obsessed with fetishizing old masters and then keeping them alive. Is this why you view universities as inherently colonial, or is it, or there are other reasons? I'm just really curious towards an expansion of that point.
No problem. Would you mind also bringing the other questions? I have the ability to answer multiple questions, and it'd be great, since it's recorded, that the other questions at least are on the table. Yeah, or on the screen.
Awesome. So another question we have on the chat is, forcing someone to wear shoes that doesn't fit is painful, but why should someone's mind be molded in the Western traditions of philosophy, even if that molding is a form of colonization, be necessarily painful? So that's the second question we have on the board at the moment.
Okay, well, the first part is very interesting, that we say the word university, singular voice, single verse. It's interesting, as you know, in Greek, it's panepistemoi, which means pan knowledges. And so it's always funny, because I could read Greek, when, you know, people say, where's the university? And you see panepistemoi, you realize there's a disjunction going on here. But of course, one of the big problems, of course, this collects the problems not only the philosophy of history, but the history of philosophy. When you study universities, you pretty much get a story about the first university in Bologna, and, you know, in the late medieval period, early Renaissance. And it's a lot like the point where, what I was making, where there's a tendency to think that if you're dealing with conceptual thinking, it all leads you back to the Greek and the Roman language. So the presupposition that the only people who think are basically Euromodern or Western. But the problem is a little deeper than that. Because if we think of universities in that way, we fail to understand that there have always been advanced research learning communities. In India, they go back 3,000 years. In East Africa, they go back 5 or more. And the other part that we tend to forget, and this is part of how colonial practices work, but it will take a lot of time to elaborate it, is to make us forget that we're dealing with human-created institutions. And when we deal with human-created institutions in such a way that they're treated almost as ontological, we fail to ask the questions of whether they are appropriate for the environments we're trying to build. The universities that we have right now function a lot like, say, let me pick South Africa as an example. Many people in South Africa, when there's the post-apartheid period, began to ask the question of what arrangements of institutions should there be to have a genuine post-apartheid society. And this is a question Fanon raised also about independence movements in Africa. And it's a very striking thing because a lot of people, whenever you have the moment of decolonization, the moment of independence, the first thing everybody wants to do is join the rest of the world. They begin to dress differently. They create their creolized or hybrid versions of foods they like, music. As you know, all over Africa, there's African hip hop, jazz, etc. There's Jamaican pizza. You could go all the way through. But what's striking is the colonial institutions of power remain intact. The university, the educational structures stay as they were. The organization of political systems continue, the parliamentary or whatever other structure the colonial regime had. The economy remains the same, etc. And one of the reasons is because, you see, universities imagine themselves as independent of the system. So if you imagine yourself as independent of the system, instead of the actual history, which is a lot of Euromodern universities were actually designed for the colonial system to function efficiently. That's why the first universities, there were learning communities of higher learning communities in, say, Abayala or the Americas for way, more than 1,000 years before the Spaniards came in. But officially, the first university was with the Spaniards. And that's because in these outposts, they needed people who had a certain form of literacy to manage the empires. And that form of learning, same with the French Empire, there's even in the British system, a lot of the exam system, the tripos, all of these things, were designed to create British civil servants. And so you have a whole system designed to have colonial administration. And then along the way, there were curious people. It's not to say, remember I said before, it's never complete. There are also people who are having creative ideas and innovations. What happens is that if you are independent of that system, then when there's the independent new system, avowed system, your response is you don't need to change because you are independent. And this is why you can have universities who imagine themselves as in liberal forms, although their entire system is designed to maintain whiteness, to maintain the organization of knowledge in such a way that the very history is rewritten. The very fact that we're even talking right now, look at the language we use. We're in a world right now where people talk about social distance, but that's a neoliberal term, right? We're physically distant because there's a pandemic, but we're not socially distant because we're able to communicate right now through this technology. And as we know, there are people who could be physically close, but socially distant. Think of a bad marriage. So, but here's the interesting thing. We're able to do this because of the ideas of two women. One is Ada Lovelace, who had the algorithm for the computer. The other one is Addie Lamar, a Jewish woman who developed a form of wireless technology through which we can have the internet. But we don't learn about those. And when I teach, what I find striking is every book I've written, every course I've taught, even the journals I put together, they always have an intellectually diverse group of people without me having to make this assert that they have to be intellectually diverse. You see what I'm getting at? It means the homogeneity that we suffer from is already a practice of the purification that actually requires more effort to eliminate the truth, which is that there are many people who contribute to knowledge and the actual ideas we use are theirs. It's always frustrating to me, for instance, when I read some philosophical texts that are announced as new, ideas where I can say exactly where they come from. When I read writings by people who are using, and it's not just about race, like Black people or gender. Even among white people, in analytical philosophy, there are a lot of contemporary analytical philosophy that's just rehashed old continental philosophy, but it's just that it's put in analytical language, but it's not an original idea. So if we come back to the point about the university, we should ask ourselves whether there is a different way to organize advanced learning communities that will be more suitable for the 21st century. And of course, to do that, it means we need to ask, if we, of course, don't destroy all life on this planet, what might be the demands for a 22nd century? Because as we know, the 20th century university was a function of 19th century people asking, given their goals, what they expect for the 20th century. So some people may object because they're saying this is a radical rethinking, but humanity has done radical rethinking many times. The only way we can get somewhere, as I always put it, is you don't get to the top of a mountain by looking at the top of a mountain. You look at the steps you need to take along the way. And what it means that we need right now as knowledge producers to begin actively building alternative knowledge communities that might have, if you use a relational way of thinking, different arrangements that may be more suitable for the world we have. And I'll give a little analogy from that. A lot of people think, if you pick women as an example, that if you just put women into the institutions, you have diversified the institutions. But if you kept the grammar of the institution as masculine, what you're doing is putting anatomical females in, but sociological males. If we think relationally, the only way women could, say, come in is if the game is changed. And that new relationship would be a different kind of game, a different kind of institution. And so I would argue that, I do argue this, that ultimately what we not only should be doing, but need to do is new kinds of relationships and practices that can actually address the problems of the world we live in. And those problems are not exclusively political, say, and they're not exclusively economic. They're also at the level of knowledge. In one of my early books, Jane Anna Gordon and I, we put together a concept we call the pedagogical imperative. And the pedagogical imperative is an idea that when we go about learning, okay, what's often raised by some people is the kind of things I'm asking for are ideas that would take up some people's time. People would say, it's not my specialization, not my area. But the thing that I've always pointed out is that what a researcher is an advanced student who just continues to learn. And as such, that continued practice of learning just means try to learn. No one is asking for anybody to know everything. What we're asking is simply to continue learning and researching. And that relational aspect would mean that that person could say, well, that's an interesting idea, let's build on it. And it may lead to other forms of knowledge. And we call it a pedagogical imperative because I think students are right when they do get upset, say, when they learn that philosophy was not exclusively Western, that it's a global practice. And if they say, because then they say, if I want to be really educated, then I should not keep having the repetition of this narrow vision of what it is to think about truth. And that means that their anger, their outrage is motivated by a desire for actually becoming educated, for actually learning. And it seems, we call it imperative because it has an ethical import to it. And so the pedagogical imperative is linked to this kind of argument. And I'm sorry, that question you had said, there was another element in it that you had mentioned. I usually would get it right away, but I was going through the thought in a way that was connecting it to that culminating point. So I think there were 6 questions I see there.
Yeah, I know you you like your questions in bundles. So we've got nice.
Go ahead.
Swath.
Yeah. So let's.
So
Yeah. Let's get some more.
I'm gonna read through all of them. I'm gonna go on
Thank
through
you.
this.
Yeah. Do that.
So first up, what reading would you recommend a beginner with philosophy to start with if they are interested in your points of views and ideas? The next question is someone thanking you for the talk and asking, have there been any societies other than that following Greek culture that have concentrated on non-relational philosophy, or is Western society out on a limb, quote unquote? The next question is, I'm interested in the signs/markers of the disciplinary decadence, your fourth point. If in an area of research, teaching, learning is not acting like a theodicy, not linker-visioned, not self-isolating, not fetishizing particular methods, not honoring a very specific root base, not working for capital, etc., does it thus act to destroy its decadence? The next question is, your comments on the marketization of society were very insightful. What do you make of the use of the term marketplace of ideas in contemporary conservative rhetoric? How do you propose we combat conservative arguments without playing their game and marketizing our own ideas? And the next question is, and the last question here, where do you see the future of philosophy going? What would you expect versus what would you hope will happen in terms of colonialism?
Okay, well, thank you for those questions. They're wonderful questions. I think I could work backwards by thinking through, well, not backwards in the sense of the past, but I think we could start by an insight from Audrey Lorde. She's a Caribbean woman who's a poet, and she's written work of philosophical significance as well. And she's very famous, particularly among literary theorists, because of a remark she made. And the remark she made is, the master's tool cannot tear down the master's house. Now, a lot of people were shocked. A lot of people repeated that. And then I came along, and Jane Anna Gordon along, and we wrote an introduction to a title of an anthology we put together called Not Only the Master's Tools. And a lot of people were shocked. It's like, oh, how dare they question Audrey Lorde? And the objection we made is this. When we say this, it still buys into the idea that the master was the bringer of the tools. You know, the greatest fear of racism, of all forms of dehumanization, is their irrelevance. If you were going to spend a lot of time reacting to them, arguing with them, they're at least relevant. And it's a reinforcement of their power. Now, I'm not saying we should never be critical, but the thing that we should bear in mind is that, first, I usually point out, a lot of the so-called master's tools were not the masters. It's a misrepresentation of history to think that enslaved and colonized people had no tools. In fact, I have to remind people that the enslaved people brought to the Americas were skilled labor. They were physicians, they were architects, they were people who did work from farming to all the way through to mathematics. A lot of their ideas, a lot of what they brought with them were understandings of the world that were actually more adaptable to the environments in which colonization took place. A lot of the Europeans, when they had first landed in these environments, died off. They could not survive because their tool set were designed, their skill set was designed for a different environment. So it's already a misrepresentation of history that the masters built everything. Few masters actually build anything. A lot of times when I give lectures in South Africa, sometimes there'd be obnoxious white individuals say, well, look at all we built. If we took it away, what did you all do? And I was like, you built what? You know, a lot of the inventions, a lot of the institutions we lived under have been structured in such a way that the recognition for them, the patterns, the very way they're recorded in history, is transformed into whiteface. And it's not to say that there are whites who did anything. Again, my point is not reactionary. My point is just for us to understand the multiplicity of how people build things. So if we come back to the master's house, which is of course, the metaphor for the colonial house, what if the project was to use our skills to build different houses, other houses? That's related to the conversation we just had about the university. If we build other houses, if the other house is a house in which people are partying, it's got everything happening in such a way that people like living there, they're flourishing, they're treated more respect, with dignity, other ideas can grow. That'll be a wonderful house. And then the masters begin to wonder, why is nobody coming over anymore? The master keeps beating his chest. I'm the master. It's like, you're something, but they're just other houses to live in. The irrelevance of the master would mean the master at that point would have to now get rid of mastery. You know, we get political insight sometimes from film. And one of the things I like about the movie The Black Panther is the superhero in The Black Panther wasn't the actual T'Challa, the Black Panther. The superhero in the film was Wakanda, the political community. Because you see, in that community, T'Challa's physical power was actually to play a role in the wider power of many contributors to the production of this polity we call Wakanda. And so if we understand it in that way, we can begin to understand that we do have a moment right now in which philosophy can be so creative, not just philosophy, but many other disciplines, but the context here is philosophy. There's some people who think reductively that there's nothing to say in philosophy, so we'll just have to continue being footnotes of Plato and keep repeating that. Whereas I see philosophy in a different way. I see this wide open world of possibilities, precisely because that other way of thinking enables the conversation with others with whom I could learn. And yes, it's unfortunate, but I have been looking through a lot of writings from antiquity, from very different places, and it really is striking. You know, Anthony Appiah has this wonderful essay in which he is critical of the notion of Western civilization to begin with. He points out that it is part of a colonial construction, you know, and it cherry picks the past. So it's actually not that the people of Europe are the way they're depicted in Western philosophy. There have always been people in Europe who thought relationally in different ways, anti-slavery, etc. It's the decadent version that reduces people to a reductive rationality, to an ontology, to a closure, because that model is at home with colonialism. And that's what leads to the stereotyping of European people. Because, you know, I mean, like, you know, I am from Jamaica, from a multiracial family who are people from China, from India, from Scotland, from Ireland, etc. So I know from my own home that from light to dark, people do a lot of the same things. And the home I was in, people were very community-oriented, relational. And when I go to visit my relatives in the Midlands of England, or my relatives in, you know, when I go and find my way to Scotland, or if I go to places where I see folks in France, what I learn is that there are white people who can dance. There are white people who can think in different way. And that's because these are white people who are not wedded to whiteness. You see, the issue is that a certain faction of how to identify people became hegemonic. But that's not the same as the people. And similarly, if you go to Africa, you could always find people across Africa who are wedded to those very same colonial models. But the everyday practice of the people is very different, because in a lot of African societies, many people have to be multilingual. They have to relate to others in a different way. And their relationship to power is very different, because it's not about the narcissistic notion that they're to have everything and dominate all of reality. It becomes about how to understand the common human condition and how we can relate to issues. And I didn't say universal, I said common. Because there is a distinction between universal and universalizing. The argument I made doesn't have to have a universal, because a universal covers a specific domain. But since I've argued that the human domain is enclosed, then at best you have universalizing, not universals. Now, the question of what you could read, I love for folks to engage primary texts. But at the same time, there are wonderful volumes that are out there that would be a good start. Okay, there's, for instance, Quasimodo's A Companion to African Philosophy. There are varieties of companion series that are very good. Not only the one on African American philosophy and others, but they're also, right now, the publishers are realizing this. They're beginning to reach out. Routledge is trying to get, for instance, I'm supposed to do a volume on global existentialism for it. And Bloomsbury is doing wonderful work, is reaching out. So you see what I'm getting at. It's no longer the case that even a lot of institutions are beginning to question how they function, and they're trying to reach for these. Now, when I gave the example about things changing, my point is this. What makes a system not change is the belief that nobody would try to change it. So we need to rethink how we think of failure. You see, all those people who tried to change things in the past, you know the way I ended my talk? If their view was the change had to happen for them, then their definition would be a failure. But if they understood, and we're now in a position to see this, that just by virtue of their efforts to make change, the system had to readjust itself. It had to now begin to respond to something it thought would happen, which is people can present alternatives, people could fight against that system, people could teach different courses, etc. Well, because of that shifting of the system, other systems open, other possibilities emerge. And we're able to have this conversation today the way we are, precisely because of what those people who preceded us did. And that preceding effort, that is what's connected to what I said in the closing. Because you see, just something like me putting just a paragraph in a syllabus to start a conversation, right? Just by virtue of taking the time to try to learn different languages, I began to realize that English by itself is an insufficient language in which to think. And it doesn't mean that when I work through other languages, I've got it. No, it's still insufficient. It's just better. You see what I'm getting at? And so what we could do, please write me, because we have a limited time together. For those of you who would like to give a list, I'll share my syllabi. That way you could get to look at some of the other works. When I teach political philosophy, I have people in the course who are from the Global South, and not as add-ons, but part of a fundamental argument, because I pick a question. When I teach political philosophy, I start with a critique, for instance, of the question of whether liberal political philosophy is an actual political philosophy. Because of what dominates political philosophy in the Anglo Academy is actually moral philosophy. So I start with that. But when I'm teaching others, I could start with another question. I'm teaching my course in Africana philosophy, and you could take it multiple times. So I decided to focus this semester on the problem of the philosophy of history. And again, the students are shocked, because they said every time they come to class, they're learning so many things. And these are graduate students. They had no idea there was so much out there. They had no idea of different questions they could ask that are so philosophically rich that connects to the questions they come with. When I teach phenomenology, or if I'm teaching, even when I teach 20th century philosophy, I focus on the question of how conceptions of reason affect the philosophical work we do, which enables me to have a conversation with philosophy of logic, for instance, the work of Frege, as an example, with somebody that could be connected into the kind of work that I would do with somebody like Kwame Gyekye. But again, it's not comparison. You see, and I have to say to everyone who understands, I don't believe in comparative philosophy. I think it's a problematic notion. Comparative philosophy always recenters Western philosophy. I actually take the position that what we should do is to try to bring a broader conversation out to deal with philosophical problems. And that means that we actually, in the process, get to learn. The analogy I could use from this is from a book by Kwasi Wirudu called Cultural Universals and Particulars. And what Kwasi, I could say Kwasi, I know him very well, argues is that we need to rethink how we think language. The old model of language treats language as vessels. So when one language system meets another language system, they look to pair up with isomorphism through which to translate the languages. And he argues that is false. Because anybody who's ever learned another language knows you have to think differently in another language. In fact, when I'm speaking another language, I look different. Right? We do things differently. And here's what he pointed out. The fallacy there, and he's totally right, the fallacy there is to treat each language system as if it was ontologically complete, as if that language system covered the whole domain of conceptual framework and possibilities, you see, of reality. What each language has is a specific historical development of how to deal with reality with a certain set of common features that could be paired up across languages. So that means when you're learning another language, you reach a point at which something is untranslatable. And what happens when you reach the untranslatable, Wirudu points out, is not that you say, okay, it doesn't work anymore, I'll buy you a beer. No, what he does, he points out, is that people just start using the term in the other language, and eventually they're able to understand it. In other words, they learn the term. And if we see that as an analogy that we could bring to disciplines and to different approaches to philosophy, then the issue when we're trying to learn the problem is that those different approaches are not about comparison. They're about developing the conceptual framework to learn something that hitherto was not contained within the language we brought to the problem. And this is why when I work, say, with theoretical physicists, I don't go in as a philosopher. I just go and try to deal with the physical problem. And we just work on it together. And I work with people, for instance, who theorize in 18 dimensions. And many people may wonder, what the hell is 18 dimensions? Well, at first they just think the mathematics add up. But after a while, they're communicating and they begin to realize their brain, their conceptual framework is changing. And this is because we human beings have a capacity not only to grow in the sense of physical growth, but we are capable of epistemic growth, of growth in knowledge. And if we understand philosophical work that way, then actually we realize that as much as we may look at ourselves as having a grand tradition, all we have done is reach a point where we're beginning to take baby steps towards our possibilities in terms of how we can relate to each other in our discussions of reality.
We have Hannes. We have a few more questions. Do we have time to give this as last ones? Okay, wonderful.
Sure.
So simple one. Can you please write the name of the philosopher you cited at the beginning? You can repeat their name, and I can put it into the.
Sure, it's Antef. Antef. A-N-T-E-F. Antef. You're talking about when I read that quotation?
I'd assume so.
Sure. In fact, let me see if I could, sometimes
Wonderful.
when I speak, here it is, I could give you the actual quotation. I could put it in the chat, okay? But this is my translation, okay? So it's there. And for those who can't get to see it, just write me. I'll just send it to you in an email. And I could send others. I could talk about Hepzibah. She was a physician, an ancient African philosopher. I could explain in more detail why I refer to Nefertiti as a philosopher, but also there are others. I mean, it's funny. I've never taught a philosophy class that has been exclusively male, and the reason is because the kind of problems I look in, it's just not only males who have looked at those problems. That course I just talked about with problems in dealing with the reduction of political philosophy to liberal moral philosophy. Some of the people I talk about in that course are Iris Young, Drusilla Cornell, Jane Anna Gordon's Crealizing Political Theory, Hu Jian from China. They're African philosophers. Frantz Fanon is obvious if you're going to talk about a critique of liberalism, etc. But they're not the only ones. When I teach existentialism, again, if you say existentialism, there are people who just pretty much give you Kierkegaard and Sartre and Heidegger. And I do have those people. I have Jaspers, but I have Beauvoir. I have Ali Shariati. I have Fanon. I have Kaiji Nishitani. I have Surya Aurobindo. And there are more. I could deal with, Vine Deloria, the metaphysics of existence. And again, it's not to pepper the course. It's just that what I discover when I teach these people is they're actually addressing the problems that people today are concerned with. And the reason is, there is a question, if I'm in the United States of America, that students have to deal with, which is this a settler society? Well, a Native American philosopher who addresses that issue is Vine Deloria, and it's right there. And so they could get to talk about it. If we're talking about a situation, say in the UK, if you read the Crealizing of Theory, what you deal with an elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is very similar to the point I just made about the tendency to impose a purity on the past. And the elephant in the room is there are no pure English women and men. And the UK is a place of constantly flowing populations of creolization and knowledge that come through. And so the very question of what is an English woman and man, and what that means in philosophical terms of the philosophy that's at work, would be, for many of the young people today, highly relevant to the contemporary UK. And the same thing with France. And or to think about the way the Moors were not simply a group of people who marched in and for 800 years dominated Southern Europe. The Moors were people who brought libraries, philosophical argumentation, rethinking the relationship of state, right, to science. Those Afro-Muslim populations were people who translated a lot of work, and translation, that's a very important, it relates to the point I made around quasi-Rudo. Most of you read Aristotle today, many people don't even realize the Aristotle they're reading, say in English, is an English translation of a Greek translation, of a Latin translation, of an Arabic translation, of a Persian translation, of a Greek original. And anybody who does translation know that you don't translate without trying to figure out a way to bring concepts that are translatable to the population you have that you're reading. So the Aristotle we read today is not actually Aristotle. It's a collection of ideas from a multitude of cultures that inform Aristotle's ideas in an imagined way that the Greek language would offer us Aristotle. And the more we can understand those things, you see, the more we can now get into some actual philosophical work. When I think about the work that Chalmers has in philosophy of mind, and I look at Surya Aurobindo on mind, it's striking because Surya Aurobindo, and this is the point, it's not that he did it first. That's not my point. But Aurobindo raised this question of the multidimensionality of mind in relation to consciousness, that they're not identical. And that ultimately, if we think about it, we have to think about what's contained in each movement of mind, because within mind, of course, it's not just mind, but mind to language, to culture, to other resources through which there can be dealing with the possibilities of mind that makes us have to rethink mind. And the way I rethink it is to think of mind more as a key. What mind is, and this is exactly the way among the Akan that Wirudu, Chiche, and others talk about mind, which is, for them, it makes no sense to talk about mind as a substance. That mind is an activity that opens up relationships to other possibilities through which we can relate to reality. And those other possibilities themselves are keys that open up more. The way I gave the analogy of theoretical physicists working through 18 dimensions. Okay.
What to think about that, and to get probably the last couple of questions of the day out. Should go. As long as global capitalism marches on and philosophy, like politics, continues to be marketized, what concrete actions can be taken to achieve a more relational, discursive, communicative model and communities of higher learning? As well as, thank you so much for the talk. It was incredibly enlightening. How do you imagine to inspire those to create the future you have so brilliantly discussed, especially when a lot of the time to get into the spaces to learn, or to have this time to have the time to learn, we so often have to be impacted by the market colonization of philosophy?
Well, two things. First, we are living in a moment of a profound conflict on a global scale. It's between the concept of globalization as privatization and globalization as the expansion of democracy, wedded to public access. The agents of privatization want the world to be the way Hobbes and Locke imagined it, so they're stuck in the 17th through 18th century. And too many people who are trying to think of the public global the way that they're still using 20th century models of revolution. However, if we go back to that example I gave about Audrey Lorde about building other houses, it's striking what happens when we start building alternatives. And I'll give you an example. Going on 20 years ago, I was when I was writing some of my, when I was founding the Department of Africana Studies at Brown, we also founded the Institute for Caribbean Thought in Jamaica. And at one of the meetings, we were celebrating the thought of Charles Laming and Sylvia Wynter. And at the meeting, it was a wonderful conference and everybody was sitting around it. And afterwards, we were by a pool. And folks were just thinking how wonderful it was that we were discussing things that we don't get to hear when we're at the American Philosophical Association or a lot of these other places. And somebody said, wouldn't it be nice if there was a Caribbean Philosophical Association? And I said, well, why don't we just create one? And so at that moment, we voted, and I had nominated somebody else to be the president. And then that person said, no, he voted for me to be the president because he said, my body of work at that time, I was the youngest and most known global Caribbean philosopher. So I said, okay, we'll meet in 3 months in my living room. And since I was the head of a chair of a department at that time, I organized a conference. That way people could come in, and we met in my living room and developed bylaws and other things. And the Caribbean Philosophical Association was born. Now, we had no way of knowing when that was born, that what it would lead to. Because you see, in the beginning, we had our first meeting, there were 40 people, and it was in Barbados. And we turned to the Atlantic Ocean and to acknowledge the enslaved people who died in that ocean. And interestingly enough, we're in the Hotel Accra. But the next meeting had 125 people, the next one 300, the next one 1,500 people. And before you know it, it's now going on 20 years later. There are book series, journals, different organizations. And In the first meeting, as we were building things, we thought, I'd written an essay where I'd argued for shifting the geography of reason. And so we thought we'd look at it. And then we realized you don't have a conference called Shifting the Geography of Reason. It's a project. It's an ongoing project. But what was striking was that at that moment, something interesting happened. You see, the people from the Anglo-Caribbean, the majority of them wanted the association to be an imitation of the North American Philosophical Association, just with Caribbean people. What Fanon would call black skin, white mask. In other words, they just wanted a nice club where Anglo-analytical Caribbean, mostly men, in fact, at that time, entirely men, would come together and they could say, this is where they could just hang out with each other and do philosophy. But I was the first president and I was adamantly against that because I argued for shifting the geography of reason. So I argued, one, let's not define in advance what philosophy is, except for to say it's a meeting of ideas. Two, I argued that we insist on being a multilingual organization where papers are presented in French, Spanish, German, and indigenous languages. Third, I argued that our age is beset by certain problems that impede the path of knowledge. So let's create an initial set of committees that are led by people to explore those questions. And one of them was a committee on questions of gender in philosophy, a committee on colonization in philosophy, a committee on how to rethink the subfields of philosophy, from epistemology and metaphysics to political philosophy. Another one on regional concerns. How do we rethink indigeneity of philosophy in Latin America? Now, at the time when I was saying that, I didn't know where they would go. But of course, the reason we quickly grew is because people in other disciplines who did write on philosophical ideas and other theoretical ideas suddenly said, oh my goodness, there's a place that can be an intellectual home. And so before you know it, not only did they start coming, but publishing houses began to rethink how they published, what kind of things they would work with. So different kinds of book series. You notice that there are a lot of encyclopedias that come out now where they will bring up African and Caribbean philosophy and other areas, but they also are beginning to rethink philosophical questions. And so what I'm saying here is giving an historical example of what happened when I said with the Audrey Lorde example of building other houses. You see, you don't know what will come out of it. But as long as you build those houses, for generations who are going to need a place as the tides shift. In other words, there has to be someone fighting against the fascism, the market forces, etc. Because just to give you a little example, an anthropologist and a sociologist got wind of what we were doing and wanted to meet with me. And when I met with them to sit down, because they wanted to figure out how did this organization grow so quickly? The first question they asked me was, who are your funders? And my answer is, we had no funders. And they were shocked. They were like, what? How could all those things grow with no funding? And I said, because we took the position that funders want to dictate to you what you're to do. So what we did when we met in that living room that day, we each took whatever we could afford from our own money and wrote a check to create a bank account for the organization. Those who didn't have much money gave $25. Those who had an affluent salary gave $1,000. Those who didn't, some $100. But it gave us a bank account. Then from there, we discovered that when you have an exciting idea and people want to work with it, they will bring that energy to it And they are involved in other situations where they have other resources. And the collective resources, because some people were heads of departments, some people were on special committees elsewhere, some people were not even academics, but they had academic training, and they were lawyers, or they all came in, and we just at each meeting created registration funds and membership funds. And before you know it, we had enough money to create summer schools, lots of other stuff. And you see where I'm getting at. This was not subordinated to the market forces. Of course, there's a material condition. We had to have money. But the big difference was we used the Anna Julia Cooper model. And Anna Julia Cooper argued that you're worth a lot if what's invested to you is smaller than the outcome that you produce. And so that means we had a high efficiency organization in which, with modest investments from members of the community, the output was huge. And because a lot of the output was also a commitment to mentoring. So now, years later, there are people who were undergraduates who came to meetings, who are just beginning graduate students, who are now full professors, who have a different model of how to do philosophy, a different model of how to communicate across the globe. Many of them took the time to learn languages. And one of the things that was funny, and we also had another rule, no session was with translators. Now, this may sound odd, but many of us had to have some language training when we got our degrees. And at first, some people struggled, but then they said, it was so interesting. They went back to learning languages. And so many of people in the organization, when we have a meeting, I go into the sessions in French, in Spanish, in Portuguese. And some sessions, I only know a modest amount of the indigenous language, but it means I try my best. And now and then I ask somebody to help me, but I always walk out learning something. So the answer is, don't look at the top of the mountain. The fact of the matter is the damage that's being done with unchecked capitalism is very real. It's right around us. We are seeing it concretely with this pandemic, what we've just gone through. And we're seeing it with the ecological damages that's being done, not only in terms of the climate conditions, but also some of the stuff from nuclear disasters all across the globe. But don't look at the top of the mountain. Look at the steps you have to take each step of the way and focus on them. All we could do back in 2003 was to think about the meeting for 2004. But because we thought creatively, and we also learned from our mistakes, some things didn't work. But because we were not arrogant, we knew that we were going to fail at things. But we agreed to admit when we're failing. And we just tried different things. But it's an organization where everybody who comes in can contribute, and we'll try it. And if it doesn't work, we try something else. And that's how ultimately the political forces to deal with neoliberalism and neoconservatism and fascism will have to come into play. Because at the end of the day, there's one thing I do know about all fascist regimes. Because fascism depends on reducing the agency of people, they're not sustainable. They become high-cost institutions. But even knowing that, the problem is the rest of us have to deal with the fallout. So we have to do the work to be there, to be prepared for dealing with the aftermath of the damage. And the best way to do it is to start building the institutions that can enable people to respond to that moment with greater agency and greater facilities of what, for want of better expression, can be called empowerment.
Yeah, a lot of what you said today really resonated with me, and yeah, it's very exciting to think about building new houses. So thank you a lot for coming and for giving this talk.